All right, let's go. Number 10. The cuirass, cut from persimmon wood. 3 pieces of shaped timber came out of a pit in Fukuoka Prefecture on the northern coast of Kyushu. A back panel, 39.8 centimeters long, including the projections at its edges, 34.6 across and between 1.8 and 5 centimeters thick. A right front panel, 46.5 by 27.7, running to 10.5 centimeters thick in places. A left front panel, 47.5 by 28. 2 half-split logs lay with them. The site is Fukai Ishimachi in Itoshima City. The pieces came from a context associated with the making of wooden tools, and they belong to the early part of the late Yayoi period, the first half of the 1st century after Christ. They are body armor cut to fit a chest. They are also unfinished. 17 Yayoi wooden armors are known from Japan. 8 are of the type carved from a solid block rather than assembled from parts, and those 8 concentrate in northern Kyushu. This one is persimmon, which is hard, dense, and close-grained. The best preserved example in the country is willow, which is none of those things. Whatever else was going on in those workshops, the choice of timber was not accidental. The finished version of this object sits at Hamamatsu, 300 kilometers east, and it is one of the best preserved pieces of prehistoric armor anywhere in the world. It was pulled out of the triple ditch system at the Iba site in 1973 and 1974. Late Yayoi, roughly 1900 years old, made of willow rather than persimmon in 2 parts, a front body and a rear body bound together around the wearer. It is also painted. There is a black lacquer ground with red laid over the top of it, worked into concentric circles, spirals, and parallel lines. X-ray fluorescence identified the red as iron oxide mixed with cinnabar. Somebody ground mercury sulfide to decorate a piece of armor. But here is where the unfinished piece does something the finished one cannot. Iba is sealed. The lacquer covers the surface, the paint covers the lacquer, and the sequence of cuts that produce the shape is buried under all of it. Fukai Ishimachi was abandoned partway through on the floor of a workshop with the split timbers it was being cut from still lying beside it. The failure is the document. Read in that order, the shaping turns out to be deliberate rather than approximate. The back panel carries projections that curve away from the body like feathers, and C-shaped elements run across all 3 components. Thickness varies by the factor of 5 inside one panel. The maker was leaving mass where mass was wanted and taking it out everywhere else. The evidence boundary here is straightforward, and it should be stated once. Nobody has demonstrated that a Yayoi wooden cuirass was worn in a fight. The material is organic, the decoration is elaborate, and the standard reading is that these were display or ceremonial equipment rather than battlefield gear. That reading rests on the decoration, not on any test, which leaves a haunting imbalance in what came down to us. We can describe the manufacture of this object in real detail, down to the order of the cuts and the species of tree, because one maker walked away from a job. We cannot say what the finished ones were for. Hamamatsu's own assessment is that in the 50 years since the Iba armor came up, nothing better preserved has been excavated anywhere in Japan. It marks the eastern limit of the distribution. Beyond it, nothing. The wood survived because a ditch stayed wet, and the red survived because mercury does not fade. What we were never sent is the reason a man in 1st century Kyushu needed a carved shell around his chest. Number 9. The boar-tusk helmet. Start with the arithmetic, because the arithmetic is the whole problem. A wild boar has 2 lower tusks. Each one runs to about 20 centimeters of usable curve, and a skilled worker can split perhaps 4 thin plates out of a single tusk. A helmet is built from rows of those plates laid edge to edge, covering the whole outer surface of a cap. The example from the cemetery at Zafarpapura near Knossos yielded 80 intact tusks. 80 tusks is 40 animals, and only the ones that survived in usable condition. Published estimates for a complete helmet run to several dozen boars, and considerably more for an elaborate one. Wild boar are not livestock. Nobody keeps them. Nobody breeds them for this, and bringing one down with Bronze Age equipment is a brutal and genuinely dangerous piece of work. So this is a hat that costs a hunting season or several. The construction is the reason it was worth it. Thin curved slivers were cut from the tusk, pierced, and sewn in rows onto a leather or felt cap lined with felt. Each plate runs 5 to 8 centimeters, and the rows alternate. One row curves one way. The row above it curves back the other, so the surface is a continuous overlapping shell in which no seam runs straight through. What makes the helmets extraordinary is not the tusks. It is the span. The earliest examples come from Colonna on Aegina, dated to somewhere around 1800 or 1600 before Christ, depending on who is arguing. The latest remains come from Calathea around 1150. Between those 2 points sit finds, what to Mycenae, Knossos, Dendra, Eleusis, Argos, Thebes, and Armenoi. There are depictions on a wall at Akrotiri, on a papyrus at Amarna in Egypt, and on a pottery sherd at Hadassa in the Hittite heartland. Egyptians and Hittites drew this object. It was recognizable a very long way from the people who made it. At Dendra, the tusk slivers came with something new: bronze cheek pieces. Marianne Modlinger reads those as the first time metal appears in the construction of a helmet anywhere in Europe. And the fully metal helmet from Knossos, from the 15th century before Christ, has cheek plates that closely resemble them. This is where European metal head protection begins. Then the object stops. The latest remains anybody can point to run from the 12th century down to the 10th. The palaces burn, the workshops go, and nobody makes another one. Some centuries after that, in Book 10 of the Iliad, Meriones hands Odysseus a helmet. The text describes a cap of hide, drawn tight inside with many thongs. The white teeth of a gleaming tusked boar are set thickly over the outside this way, and that well and skillfully, with a felt lining fitted in the middle. Then it gives the object's provenance, stolen by Autolycus out of a house at Ilion Past to Amphidamas, given as a guest gift to Molus, handed down to his son. This way and that. The Greek is in thaka and thaka, and it is the alternating direction of the rows. A poem describes the one construction detail that a person who had merely heard about the object would have no reason to invent. The boundary matters, and it is a real one. The Iliad was written down centuries after the last of these helmets went into the ground. It is not a technical manual, and it is not a witness. What we have inside it is a description, not a testimony. The helmet at Heraklion sits under a label calling it a symbol of rank for ceremonial display rather than working armor. That may be right. It was still made by somebody who killed 40 pigs, split the teeth into plates by hand, and sewed them onto a cap in alternating rows so the seams would not line up. Centuries after the last one was finished, a poet who could not possibly have seen one still knew which way the teeth went. Number 8. The plate armor of the Bering Strait. St. Lawrence Island sits in the Bering Strait, closer to Chukotka than to Alaska, in a strip of water that has worked for millennia as a road rather than a barrier. Around the year 600, something arrives on it. The archaeological marker is the Punuk period, and it comes as a package. A sinew-backed composite bow, guards worn on the wrist to take the slap of the bowstring, and lamellar plate armor built from rectangular plates of bone antler or walrus ivory, drilled and secured with cross straps to a leather lining. There is a second type as well, and it is stranger. Band armor has no leather backing at all. The plates are held to each other. A neck cover made from split walrus tusk sits above a skirt of ivory plate rows that telescopes. It collapses up towards the hips when the wearer needs to move and drops back down when he does not. That is a mechanism, not a garment. Somebody solved a problem. European armorers would meet again centuries later and solved it in sea mammal tooth. Owen Mason describes the whole assemblage as a war complex, and the direction of travel is not seriously in doubt. Slat armor, possibly of ivory, is first recorded in 3rd century Manchuria. The technology moves north and then east across the strait and lands in Alaska. The stratigraphy backs that up in a limited way. At the deep midden at Serenki in southern Chukotka and at Ivegyak and Siklukak, armor turns up only in the upper levels. At Mayughak and the hillside, it does not appear at all. 4 houses at Cape Chaplino produce the compound bow together with bone armor, exactly the combination the model predicts. That site has never been dated. For a long time, the metal versions were read as part of the same story. Plates of bronze and brass in identical lamellar arrangements sitting in museum collections, and assumed to be later imports coming down the same road as the bone. Except the metal is not ancient. Corey Cooper and Gabriel Bowen published the test in Arctic Anthropology in 2013. They ran X-ray fluorescence on 107 metal armor plates held at the University of Alaska Museum of the North from 3 sites on St. Lawrence Island, Kealiguk, Kukulek, and Gamble. 73 came back bronze. 32 came back brass. And brass carrying more than 28% zinc cannot be produced by any process available before the early to middle 19th century. That is not Asian trade metal. That is whaling ship material cut, chopped up, and repurposed. One iron example in the wider corpus has French silver coins of Louis XVI riveted onto it. So the sequence inverts, and the result is more unsettling than the assumption it replaced. The bone and ivory armor is the ancient technology running for something like 1,000 years. The metal armor is the recent upgrade. It was cut from the hulls and fittings of the ships that came to strip the Bering Sea of whales. The people cutting it already knew precisely what shape a lamellar plate should be. Their grandfathers had been making them out of walrus tusk. The same pattern runs down the coast. At the American Museum of Natural History in New York, there is a tlingit armor built from a moosehide shirt, covered in Chinese coins laid out in chevrons. Beside it sits a slat armor of hidewood and sinew with the painted hide undergarment that was worn beneath it. When conservators worked on those pieces, they consulted the tlingit carver Tommy Joseph, and he corrected them. The coin armor had been mounted wrongly. The slat elements were out of alignment. The knowledge was not in the museum. It was still with the people the armor came from. A complete set of ivory plate armor is held at the Sheldon Jackson Museum in Sitka. Band armor sits in the Smithsonian and in the Kunstkamera in St. Petersburg. Every plate on them is drilled in a pattern that first shows up in Manchuria. Between those 2 points, we cannot date a single object anywhere along the road. Number 7. The Marmesse cuirasses. In 1974, at a place called Le Petit Marais, outside the village of Marmesse, in the Haute-Marne machinery, working a sand quarry turned up bronze. 3 cuirasses came out of the ground. They had been stacked one inside another like cups. More followed. There was an archaeological survey in 1980, and further pieces are recorded in 1986. The final count is genuinely argued. The Musée d'Archéologie Nationale and the Standard Catalog say 7. Regional records and the French literature say 9. Anybody quoting a single number is quoting one side of an open question. Each cuirass is 2 shells, a breastplate and a backplate riveted at the left shoulder and hooked shut on the right, so the whole thing opens like a clamshell around the ribs. One of them, inventory number 83,756, is 51 centimeters tall, 35.5 across the base, and weighs 2,576 grams. That is under 2.5 kilos of metal, covering a man's entire torso. The sheet is less than a millimeter thick. The alloy runs about 90% copper and 10% tin. Getting there is the achievement. A flat disc was cast, and then it was worked. Cold, hammered out over a form, so the metal stretched and thinned. Annealed between passes to relieve the stress before it cracked, and then polished. Anne Lahorf puts the labor at over 150 hours from casting to finish, consuming 3 to 4 kilograms of raw metal for each cuirass. The decoration is punched from behind. A central line of bosses about a centimeter across, running down the sternum, and the spine flanked on both sides by rows of smaller ones laid out to follow the ribcage. They are not isolated. At Fillinges in Haute-Savoie, navvies widening a road below the village in 1900 dug into 7 more elements, 3 breastplates and 4 backplates, nested in a layer of ash, 3 of them decorated with the heads of waterbirds. A cuirass from Saint-Germain-du-Plain was dredged out of the Saône undamaged, which means somebody gave it to the river on purpose. We have about 30 metal cuirasses from the whole of Europe. For most of the 20th century, the reading of objects like these was that nobody ever fought in them. John Coles and Anthony Harding treated European Bronze Age plate as parade equipment, metal a millimeter thick, beaten out to a mirror finish and covered in decoration, looks like display. And then the damage. The Marmesse cuirasses carry ancient repairs. Somebody mended them while they were in service, which is not a thing anybody does to a costume. The harder evidence came out of the Danube, and it is more disturbing than any amount of decoration. A cuirass dredged from the river at Pilis Marat in Hungary, bought by the Szent István Károlyi Museum in 1982, stands 44.7 centimeters high in sheet between 0.7 and 1.13 millimeters thick. Eva Petrus and Katalin Jankovic published it in 2014. On the neck of the backplate, there is a sword cut roughly 4 centimeters long, and beside it, a stab mark with an exit. Somebody was wearing that when it happened. At Kaka in Slovakia, under a mound 52 meters across, excavated by Anton Toček from the winter of 1950, a man was cremated wearing his. The cuirass went onto the pyre, with the body, so what survives is fragments. The earliest bell-shaped sheet bronze armor in Central Europe is also the least complete piece of it. One limitation stated plainly. There is no stratified context at Marmesse, and the dating rests purely on typology and style. The museum says so in its own words. 9th to 8th century before Christ is an estimate, and a serious argument exists for pushing it earlier. The unsettling detail at Marmesse is not the metalwork. It is the arrangement. These were not engraves. 7 or 9 of them nested inside each other and set into the ground in a triangle at a place the museum reads as a votive deposit connected with a spring. Somebody stacked a small unit's worth of body armor, carried it to water, and gave it away. There are no bodies in that hole at all. Number 6. Tutankhamun's cuirass. Howard Carter's object, number 587, is a wooden box found in the annex, the small chaotic room off the antechamber. Inside it were 4 things: a pair of sandals, a taillette amulet in faience, a jet in glass, and 587A, a leather cuirass. Carter wrote it up on 3 cards in the early 1930s. After that, for the better part of 70 years, it was left alone in storage. It is a sleeveless shirt of leather scales, at least 57 centimeters long, reaching the middle of Tutankhamun's thigh. It opens at the back and ties at the shoulders with leather thongs. It originally carried well over 4,000 scales. More than 3/4 of it is gone. What survives is 2 larger laced sections, one of them still holding its linen backing, and over 200 loose scales in a storage tray. The surviving detail is very fine. The scales run 26 to 58 millimeters long, 8 to 24 wide, and 1.3 to 2.5 thick. Each one has a vertical ridge pressed into it in high relief, about 1.9 millimeters deep on the large scales. The backing is 6 layers of plain weave linen at roughly 64 threads to the inch, sandwiched with a thin leather layer. The scales were colored red and green, and about 2/3 of the rows are red. Andre Veldmeyer, Thomas Hewlett, Lucy Skinner, and Salima Ikram reconstructed the process and published it in 2020. Templates marked the scales out on the hide. The hide was partially hydrated, so it could be cut. The lacing holes were driven with a small chisel-ended punch, while the leather was still damp. The ridge was formed by pressing the flesh side of each scale down over a groove used as a mold. Then, they were dried under control between sheets of linen over roughly 24 hours, so the shrinkage could be managed. The hole patterns are uniform. That is the signature of batch production, not of one craftsman making one object, and it is an extraordinary thing to find inside a royal burial. The problem is the material. For decades, our assumption was cuir-bouilli leather, hardened by heat and water into something rigid, because rigid sounds like armor. Hewlett and Skinner tested replicas independently, and the result went the other way. The cuir-bouilli scales were brittle and shattered on impact, untanned rawhide, dented permanently, and did not break. This armor is made of the material that looks less finished, and that was the correct choice. Metal was the exception in Egypt, not the rule. The Metropolitan Museum holds 10 bronze scales from the palace of Amenhotep III at Malkata, recovered in 1910 and 1911, each about 11.5 centimeters long. The curatorial note is blunt. Body armor of that kind was a foreign import and probably not commonly worn. Behind the object sits an industry all the same. At Quantir ancient Marmesse in the eastern delta, Edgar Pusch's Hildesheim mission excavated a bronze foundry with no parallel elsewhere in Egypt. It could process several hundred kilograms of bronze in one short campaign. Beside the melting installations were workshops cutting sheet metal into armor scales to be stitched onto backings. In one stratum, the output is body armor of leather and metal scales. In the next, it changes over to shields and shield fittings. One caution is necessary here. In 2018, a press release and a television program reported that reflectance imaging showed abrasion along the edges of the scales and concluded the boy king had worn his armor in battle. The peer-reviewed paper contains no wear argument and makes no such claim. Treat the battlefield as television. What the object is, without any of that, is the only fairly complete piece of late Bronze Age body armor recovered from anywhere in the Eastern Mediterranean. The cuirass now sits in the Conservation Center at the Grand Egyptian Museum under the number GEM 11655. 3/4 of it no longer exists. What survived is the part nobody bothered to read for 80 years, a pattern of punched holes, repeated exactly 4,000 times over. Those hole patterns are almost the same in the Levant, in Anatolia, and in the Aegean. The one detail of this armor that was never Egyptian is the only one that came through intact. Number 5. The helmets in the death pits of Ur. Picture a ramp cut down into the ground at Tel El Mukayyar in southern Iraq, sometime between about 2600 and 2400 before Christ. At the bottom of it is a tomb. On the ramp itself laid out in order are people. Some of them are wearing helmets. Leonard Woolley excavated the Royal Cemetery there through the 1920s, and the objects from it are still among the strangest things in any museum. British Museum, number 121,414, is one of them, and the catalog description is not softened for the visitor. A man's skull crushed flat with a semicircular copper alloy helmet crushed with it. The record identifies him as soldier number 46 on the ramp of the king's grave. He was lifted in a block of earth 38 centimeters square, and he is on display in London today. He is not alone in the collection. Other entries read as copper alloy helmet and human skull bones encased in paraffin wax x-rayed by the museum's own scientific department. Another is a helmet with a man's leg bones. One of those wax blocks was rediscovered during a departmental move in the summer of 2002, which tells you how completely a thing can vanish inside an institution that has not lost it. The famous helmet from the same cemetery came out of a different grave. In the 1927 to 1928 season, Woolley opened PG 755, an undisturbed shaft, 2.5 meters by 1.5. Out of it came an axe head of electrum, 2 gold bowls, a gold lamp, a silver belt with a gold dagger, a whetstone of lapis lazuli copper saws, and rows of spearheads laid at the head and the feet. Several of the vessels are inscribed with a name, Mes Kalam Dug, and a helmet of gold worked in the form of a wig. Catalogued as U10000, registered in Baghdad as IM8629. The British Museum displays an electrotype copy of it made by Commons of London. It is a shell in the shape of a head close-fitting, with the hair rendered as raised strands running back from the brow, the ears left standing, proud of the surface, and the hair gathered into a bun at the nape. Around the lower edge is a line of small holes, which Woolley read as stitching for a padded lining. What that describes is somebody in the middle of the 3rd millennium before Christ raising a fitted anatomical shell out of sheet metal and getting the ears right. Raising a shell like that is not a matter of beating metal until it is roughly right. Sheet has to be worked in stages and softened by heat between them, because metal stretched too far in one pass splits instead of moving. Every raised strand of hair on it is a controlled deformation, and there is no undoing one. The title is where it gets complicated. Nothing inscribed in PG 755 calls Mescalamdug a king. The word Lugal turns up on a cylinder seal bearing his name, and Woolley recorded that seal in a completely different grave. Julian Reed and others have argued from this that the man in PG 755 may not be the man on the seal. Mescalamdug is not in the Sumerian king list at all. His son is a lapis bead in a hoard at Mari names Mesanapeda as king of Ur and son of Mescalamdug, king of Kish. What happened on the ramps is still argued, and it should be left argued. Woolley's reading was that the attendants went down into the pit alive and took something to die. Later work on the skulls has raised the possibility of something more violent. The evidence is thin. The individuals were real people, and the honest position is that the manner of their deaths is not settled. The helmets are not in doubt. They were on the heads. So the oldest metal head protection we can put a finger on reaches us in two conditions. And the pairing is a disturbing one. One is gold, made by the craftsman, good enough to model a human ear in a sheet, a fraction of a millimeter thick, and it carries a name that may not belong to the man it was buried with. The others are copper, flattened, and still contain the men who were wearing them. Those men are cataloged by number. 46 is one of them. Number 4. The armor that arrived from the wrong empire. Grave IIM 127 at the Yanghai Cemetery in the Turfan Basin, in what is now Xinjiang, held a man of about 30, laid out on a wooden frame. The goods around him are modest and specific. 2 horse cheek pieces, one of horn and one of wood. 5 wooden pegs, a single-handled jar, a pot, a cup, and a bowl. A wooden comb, a fire drill, the skull of a sheep, and an armor which is not modest at all. It was built from 5,444 small scales and 140 large ones. Over 5,300 are still there. The standard scale measures 25 millimeters by 15, weighs half a gram, and carries a single row of 3 slits punched 3 millimeters below the top edge. The scales alone come to about 3.1 kilograms. Complete with lining and lacing it is 4 to 5 kilos. The material is cow rawhide, dressed with fat or oil, and it was never tanned. A team at Zhengzhou University confirmed that in 2024 by looking for aromatic signals in the collagen and finding none. Dating it took luck. A plant thorn had been driven into one of the scales and stayed there. Radiocarbon on the thorn calibrates to between 786 and 543 before Christ. The construction is where this becomes something other than a well-made coat. The scales are sewn in rows onto a leather lining, each row overlapping about half the row beneath it. Every row is also offset sideways by roughly a third of a scale's width, so no vertical line of stitching runs through the armor anywhere. The front cover is 67.5 centimeters long with 23 rows in the central section. The lower part is deliberately lopsided, 10 rows on the left side, 13 on the right, with a triangular section cut away on the left. The authors read that cut out as clearance for getting a leg over a horse. Then the detail that changes what kind of object this is. One person can put it on unaided, wrapping it round the back, tying it under the right arm and pulling it shut, with thongs crossing to the opposite hip. And it adjusts. The same armor fits men of different sizes, which is an extraordinary thing to build in the 8th century before Christ. That is not a bespoke object made for one warrior. That is issued kit. But here is where it stops being local. Patrick Vertman and a team spanning Zurich, Turfan, Moscow, Bonn, Berlin, and the Metropolitan Museum published it in 2021 and argued the design is Neo-Assyrian. Their case is the standardization itself. Batch-cut scale types, identical slit patterns, modular panels, one size fitting many bodies. In the 7th century before Christ, that approach to equipping soldiers is documented for exactly one army. The palace reliefs of Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal at Nineveh and Nimrud show troops in armor built on the same logic. They also point at a second object, The Metropolitan Museum owns a leather scale armor of the same era find spot unknown, 70.5 centimeters high. 56 rows of hardened scales are laced onto a soft leather lining. The museum calls it the best preserved scale armor from antiquity. It is stylistically close to the Yanghai piece and built differently. Wertmann's team read the pair as two unit types from one production system, the way an infantry pattern and a cavalry pattern differ inside a single modern army. The objection is worth as much as the argument. Sean Manning points out that the girdle of tall scales at the waist is a step feature rather than an Assyrian one. Assyrian reliefs show armor covering the body front and back, completely not stopping at the lower back. And every piece of Assyrian armor anybody has excavated is iron or bronze with no leather examples at all. The authors concede the weakness themselves. No complete scale armor survives from any Assyrian context, so the comparison is being made against pictures carved on a wall. Set the attribution aside, and the object still says the same thing. The idea inside it is not leather. It is the notion that a soldier's protection should be a repeatable product rather than a commission cut in batches, by people who never meet the wearer and adjustable to whoever turns up. The unsettling part is where it ended up. That idea is in a grave in the Turfan Basin. Around 700 before Christ, 5,000 kilometers from anywhere, it is documented, and we cannot say which road it came down. Number 3. The armor cut out of limestone. Pit K9801 lies about 200 meters southeast of the burial mound of the first Qin emperor outside Lintong, near Xi'an. It runs 130 meters east to west and 100 north to south. 13,000 square meters. It is the largest accessory pit found anywhere in the mausoleum precinct. Excavation began in April 1998, and the trial trench opened roughly 150 square meters of it. Out of that fraction came 87 sets of armor and 43 helmets plus stone horse armor and bronze chariot fittings. The suits are lamellar. A reconstructed example is built from 612 individual plates of green-gray karstic limestone between 2 and 11 millimeters thick. Assembled, it weighs about 18 kilograms and stands 125 centimeters from top to bottom. Each plate is drilled around its edges. The plates were laced together with flat copper wire, most of which has mineralized away to a green stain in the stone. The helmets are built the same way. One of them is 31.5 centimeters high and consists of 74 separate pieces, a single plate for the crown, and 73 more for the sides arranged in 6 layers running front to back. It weighs about 3.2 kilos. In 2023, a team led from the Bioarchaeology Laboratory at Jilin University published the workshop behind it. Production had been broken down into a fixed sequence of 9 repetitive steps. The drilling method was reconstructed from wear patterns inside the holes themselves, and geological analysis established that the limestone is not local. Somebody was hauling raw stone a long distance to a site that had unlimited access to clay. They were not working alone. The same study set K9801 alongside other production evidence in the region. There is a well at Xinfeng near the Wei River opened in 2001. There is a workshop site at Liujiagu in Xianyang, investigated in 2019, where 144 square meters produced 32,392 artifacts. This was an industry with site stages and supply lines. The excavation team's own estimate for the labor is the figure that lands hardest. A single craftsman working 8 hours a day needs between 344 and 444 days to finish one suit. About a year per man per suit for an object made of rock. Except it is not armor. Duan Qingbo, who headed the archaeological team, put it flatly. The arsenal was built merely to be buried with the emperor, and it cannot be real armor because it breaks if you hit it with a stick. It is a substitute in exactly the way the terracotta figures are substitutes for men. Stone was chosen for one property. It decays more slowly than leather. That is the entire reasoning. Somebody asked which material would still be in the ground in 1,000 years. Got the right answer, and then had a year of a man's life carved into every suit. which is the turn, and it is a genuinely unsettling one. The real arsenal is gone. Every strap, every lacquered lamella, every hide of it. What survives is the copy. The copy is a measured record of the original taken plate by plate. The shape of each lamella, the number in each row, the direction of the overlap, the position of every lacing hole. The most accurate picture we have of chin body armor was carved by people whose entire purpose was to make something that would still be there. The scale of what remains underground is not settled, and the numbers in circulation are estimates rather than counts. Reporting on the renewed excavation season in 2013, which produced the first stone horse armor from the pit, ranged from more than 1,000 pieces to more than 6,000 sets, to a plate count in the millions. Only a fraction of 13,000 square meters has ever been opened. What has been opened lies where it fell, and it is a haunting thing to look at. Suits of stone laid out on the floor of a trench in the shape of men who were never inside them, laced with wire that has turned to stain, waiting for a war that was always going to be fought somewhere else. Number 2. The suits that survive only as paperwork. Around 1,180. Before Christ, the palace at Pylos burned. The tablets stacked inside it were unfired clay working documents written to be soaked down and reused within the year. Fire is the only thing that could have preserved them, and fire is what they got. Whoever kept those records had no intention of leaving anything behind at all. The script is linear. B, deciphered by Michael Ventris and published with John Chadwick in 1956. It is not literature. It is accountancy, inventories, ration lists, personnel livestock chariot components. And among the Pylos tablets, there is a series that records body armor using the word Torah-K. The numbers are the extraordinary part. Of the 20 sets of armor listed in that series, 16 record 20 large opawota and 10 small ones. The remaining 4 record 22 large and 12 small. Opawota means literally things hung on. Chadwick read them as the plates attached to a corselet. So a suit of Mycenaean body armor as issued at Pylos was 30 to 34 plates. A helmet took 4 plus 2 cheek pieces. We have the parts list. The vocabulary around it is just as granular. There are separate words for arm guards, for shoulder pieces, for cheek pieces, and for the helmet itself. There are dedicated signs as well. One stands for the corselet alone, another used at Pylos, and on a fragment from Tiryns found in 1974, fuses a corselet and a helmet into a single ideogram. On tablets at Thebes, the attachment plates are abbreviated down to one letter and counted off in a column, 3014. 65332. Knossos ran the same system earlier, and its records are more revealing still. In the SC series from the earliest linear B deposit on Crete, each tablet ties a named man to a corselet, a chariot, and a team of horses. 2 corselets per chariot is the normal issue, one for the fighter and one for the driver. And that pairing is explicit on 14 tablets. A second series simply lists around 77 pairs of men who already hold the complete outfit. Estimates of what that adds up to vary by scholar and by what is being counted. Jan Driesen's analysis of the chariot tablets implies an operational force of somewhere between 173 and 250 units. Others read the surviving Knossos record as covering between 450 and 600 fully equipped individuals. Those are different measurements, and they should not be stacked on top of each other. The scale of the archive tells its own story. When François Vandenabeele and Jean-Pierre Olivier catalogued the archaeological signs of Linear B in 1979, 138 of 284 pages went on defensive armor weapons horses, chariots, and wheels. Very nearly half of that catalog is military equipment. The truly unsettling part is the arithmetic that follows. Barry Malloy went through every fragment of Aegean plate armor from every excavation, every shoulder guard, every neck piece, every stray plate, and concluded that from all of it we can define perhaps 8 suits of plate armor at best. 8. Against a bureaucracy tracking them by the 100 by name in pairs with the plate count written down. Note, the interpretation carries a caveat the specialists themselves apply. Reading Opawota as armor plates is an inference from context, not a translation anybody can prove, and the people who use it say so in print. Chadwick went further in 1976 and suggested some of this armor was a composite of linen and bronze, on the strength of a Knossos tablet that lists a linen tunic together with a weight of copper. That remains a proposal. The counts are also only what one fire happened to bake hard in one room, which is the position, and it has not improved with time. A palace administration in the 13th century, before Christ, knew exactly how many plates went into a corselet, wrote the figure on wet clay, and expected to wipe it off again in a few months. The armor is gone, all of it into corrosion and reuse and the ground. What we were left with is the stock check, and we have that only because the building fell in on the people who were keeping it. Number 1. The Dendra panoply. In November 1959, 3 archaeologists walked over a Mycenaean cemetery at Dendra near Media in the Argolid. Nikolaus Verdelis of the Greek Archaeological Service, with Paul Astrom, and Carl Gustaf Styrenius of the Swedish Institute at Athens. The roof of a chamber tomb had collapsed, leaving a fissure in the earth. They excavated it in 1960. Robbers had reached part of the tomb shortly before them. They had not reached all of it. What came out of Chamber Tomb 12 is the most complete suit of body armor surviving from Bronze Age Europe, and it is not scale and it is not mail. It is plate, roughly 15 pieces of bronze sheet, 1 to 1.5 millimeters thick, in an alloy running 10 to 12% tin. Take it apart, and the engineering is extraordinary. A front plate and a back plate hinged together on the left side and closed with loops on the right. A tall gorget standing up around the neck. 2 shoulder guards. 2 triangular plates covering the armpits. 2 pieces for the upper arms. 3 curved plates suspended at the front, and 3 more at the back hanging over the groin and thighs. 1 greave. Every plate is drilled backed with leather and lashed with oxhide thong. Bound correctly, the hanging plates ride up behind one another as the wearer bends like a concertina. It covers a man from the neck to the knees, and the man it was made for stood over 1.77 meters. With it were slivers of boar's tusk from a helmet, and that helmet had bronze cheek pieces. The date is the end of the 15th century before Christ, around 1400. For 60 years, the consensus was that it did not work. Oliver Dickinson called it clumsy and probably devised for chariotry. It would need heavy internal padding, could not be put on without help, and would effectively stop a man who had fallen from getting up again. Mary Littauer argued it was for the chariot and impossible to use on foot. Robert Drews argued the exact reverse. Coles and Harding put Bronze Age plate in the parade equipment category generally. A museum caption in Thebes still restricts armor of this kind to ceremonial occasions. In 1984, staff and students in the metalworking department at Bournville College of Art in Birmingham built a copy for the archaeologist Diana Wardle. They used gilding metal, 95% copper, and 5% zinc, and reproduced every plate's dimensions, curvature, and perforations. Leather edging, leather thongs, resin plaques imitating boar's tusk, and an inner cap plaited by hand following Homer. 23.32 kilograms on a laboratory scale. Then, somebody tested it properly. Andreas Fleuris of the FAME Laboratory at the University of Thessaly, with colleagues in Greece, Britain, and Portugal, published the results in PLOS 1 on the 22nd of May, 2024. Diana Wardle is the last author, and she did not live to see it in print. What makes the result hold up is the work underneath it. They read the Iliad twice independently and coded what is actually in it: 152 combat encounters and 265 individual moves. 78% are one-on-one duels between men on foot. 80% of encounters are over inside 3 moves. Then, they built a working day out of it. Sunrise and sunset in the Troad in June in the Late Bronze Age fall at 4:37 and 19:37. An army leaving 2.5 hours after first light and stopping 90 minutes before dark gives a fighting day from 7 in the morning until 6 at night. 11 hours. They reconstructed the food, too, at 4,443 calories. Bread, cheese, olives, and wine at breakfast. meat, and bread at night. 13 Marines of the Hellenic armed forces then put the armor on and fought in it for 11 hours. The laboratory was held between 24 and 29 degrees at 70 to 85% humidity. They ate that diet and worked through rotating encounter types drawn from the text. All 13 finished. Core temperature never left the range between 36.4 and 37.7 degrees. There was no significant change in blood lactate, grip strength, reaction, time hydration, or any of the inflammatory markers they measured. Blood glucose declined moderately across the day, and that was the extent of it. Over 99% of the blows landed above the threshold at which bone fractures. The authors are careful and list 8 limitations of their own. The replica is a replica. The Marines are trained modern soldiers, not Bronze Age warriors. And demonstrating that something can be done is not evidence that it was done. The panoply itself is in a case in the Archaeological Museum of Naflion, a few kilometers from where it was buried. 15 pieces of 1 millimeter bronze green, now holding the shape of a man who has not been inside it for 3,500 years. Every object in this countdown was called ceremonial by somebody. The wooden one was decorative. The bronze cuirasses were parade gear until a sword cut turned up on one. The stone suits were never armor, and they are now the most accurate record of Qin armor in existence. The Dendra panoply sat under a label saying it could not be worn for 60 years until 13 men wore it for 11 hours and walked home. The armor was never the thing that was too advanced for its age. It was the estimate we had made of the age. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.